At the age of 20, most young men are still searching for themselves. Alexander of Macedon was handed a kingdom surrounded by enemies, a court filled with suspicion, and a future that looked far less secure than legend would later make it seem. By the time he was 32, he had crushed the greatest empire on earth, marched farther east than any Greek king before him, founded cities across continents, and become the measure by which conquerors would be judged for the next 2,000 years. His life burned fast, bright, and dangerously. And the question that still follows his name is as powerful now as it was then. How did one man come so close to conquering the world? To understand Alexander, you first have to understand the world he entered. The Greek world was brilliant, proud, and deeply divided. City-states like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth had produced philosophers, soldiers, artists, and statesmen, but they had also exhausted themselves through endless rivalry. Alliances rose and shattered. Victories turned into humiliations. Even when Greeks spoke of freedom, they rarely meant freedom for all Greeks. They meant freedom for themselves. Meanwhile, to the east, the Persian Empire stretched across an immense portion of the known world. Its kings ruled over vast lands, rich cities, imperial roads, royal treasuries, and armies drawn from many peoples. Persia was not some fragile giant waiting to fall. It was the superpower of its age. For generations, it had seemed untouchable. And then there was Macedonia. To many southern Greeks, Macedonians were rougher, harder, and less refined. Their kingdom sat on the edge of the Greek world, close enough to influence it, far enough to be looked down upon by it. Yet while the city-states argued, Macedonia changed. Under King Philip II, it became something new, disciplined, ambitious, and militarily terrifying. Philip reshaped the army, strengthened the state, used diplomacy when it served him, war when it did not, and gradually bent much of Greece under his power. He did not merely inherit a kingdom, he forged a machine. But the son who would inherit that machine was not content to preserve it. He wanted more, much more. Alexander was born into power, but not into certainty. His father, Philip, was a formidable ruler and a brilliant commander, but he was also a dangerous man to grow up around. He won glory in battle, made enemies with ease, and kept the court tense with ambition, rivalries, marriages, and shifting loyalties. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was fierce, proud, deeply religious, and intensely protective of her son. Ancient writers would later surround her with rumors, symbols, and dark fascination. But what matters most is that she helped convince Alexander that he was destined for greatness. From Philip, he saw power in action. From Olympias, he may have absorbed the idea that his life was marked by something larger than ordinary kingship. He was also given an education few princes could rival. Aristotle, one of the greatest minds in history, was brought to teach him. Whether Alexander absorbed every lesson in philosophy as eagerly as later admirers like to imagine is impossible to know, but he certainly learned to think of himself within a grand tradition of Greek culture, heroism, and inquiry. He admired Homer. He reportedly kept a copy of the Iliad close at hand. Achilles was not just a literary figure to him. He was an ideal, swift, glorious, nearly unmatched, and remembered forever. For Alexander, that final part mattered most. To win was one thing. To be remembered was another. He wanted both. Stories from his youth already hinted at the force of his character. The most famous tells of the horse Bucephalus, a magnificent animal that no one could tame. While others failed, Alexander noticed that the horse was frightened by its own shadow. He turned it toward the sun, mounted it, and brought it under control. Whether every detail is true matters less than the way the story survived. It captures what people came to believe about him, that where others saw chaos, he saw the hidden weakness. Where others hesitated, he acted, and where others backed away, he pressed forward. This would become the pattern of his life. Yet Alexander's path to power was never smooth. The Macedonian court was full of danger. Philip married more than once. Each marriage had political meaning. Each new alliance created new tensions. Questions of succession hung over everything. Alexander was the son of the king, but royal courts are not governed by sentiment. They are governed by advantage, fear, and timing. At times, father and son seemed united. At other times, the relationship cracked with suspicion and rivalry. Philip's victories grew. So did his stature. Alexander, brilliant and proud, could not easily live in the shadow of such a father. Nor could Philip have failed to notice that his son possessed the hunger to outshine him. Even before he became king, Alexander proved himself in war. At the Battle of Chaeronea, fought when he was still very young, he seems to have played a major role in the Macedonian victory over the Greek coalition. This battle was decisive. It broke the resistance of key Greek powers and confirmed Macedonia's dominance. For Alexander, it was more than a military success. It was a demonstration. He was not merely a prince educated for ceremony. He could command, strike, and win. The Greek world had seen Philip's power. It was now catching a first glimpse of Philip's heir. Then, in 336 BC, everything changed. Philip II was assassinated. In a single moment, the architect of Macedonian power was gone, and the kingdom he had built was exposed to every danger that follows a ruler's sudden death. Rivals could move. Enemies could rebel. Allies could defect. Greece could rise. Foreign powers could test the succession. And at the center of all this stood Alexander, only 20 years old. To later generations, it might seem obvious that he would seize the throne and begin an age of conquest. To the men around him at that moment, nothing was obvious. Youth could be fatal. Hesitation could be fatal. Mercy could be fatal. Alexander responded as if he understood that kingship is often secured before it is ever truly worn. He moved swiftly against threats, real and potential. In the brutal logic of the ancient world, he eliminated rivals, stabilized the succession, and made clear that Philip's death would not mean Macedonian weakness. This was not cruelty for spectacle. It was power answering chaos in the only language courts and kingdoms fully understood. He was young, but he did not act young. He acted like a man who knew that if he gave fear a single opening, it would swallow his reign before it began. The Greek city-states were not eager to remain obedient to a new Macedonian king. Some saw Philip's death as an opportunity. Some hoped the Macedonian grip would loosen. Others simply doubted that Alexander possessed his father's authority. He answered those doubts with terrifying speed. Marching south, he reasserted control and showed that rebellion would be met, not negotiated with, but crushed. The most dramatic example came at Thebes. After revolt broke out there, Alexander besieged and destroyed the city. The lesson was unmistakable. This was not a nervous boy inheriting borrowed power. This was a ruler prepared to make himself feared if that was what was required to make himself obeyed. Once Greece was secured, Alexander turned toward the goal that had already been imagined in his father's time: invasion of the Persian Empire. Publicly, the campaign could be framed as revenge, a continuation of the long memory of Persian invasions into Greece. It could be sold as liberation for Greek cities in Asia Minor. It could be presented as justice, destiny, or pan-Hellenic leadership. But beneath all that stood Alexander himself. He was not crossing into Asia merely to complete a policy. He was crossing into Asia to test the limits of human ambition. His army was not enormous by imperial standards. His enemy ruled one of the richest and most extensive empires in the world. On paper, the gamble was breathtaking. In reality, it bordered on madness. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia, legend and strategy fused together. He was entering the lands of epic memory, but he was also opening a campaign that would determine whether he would be remembered as a daring king or a dead one. Early on came the Battle of the Granicus River, where he faced Persian forces and won. The victory mattered not only because it opened Western Asia Minor to him, but because it set the psychological tone for everything that followed. Alexander fought boldly, sometimes recklessly, and placed himself where danger was greatest. This was leadership of a kind soldiers could see with their own eyes. He did not ask others to risk what he would not risk himself. It inspired loyalty. It also fed the growing sense that he believed himself protected by destiny. As cities in Asia Minor submitted or were taken, Alexander cultivated an image. He could appear as liberator, avenger, rightful ruler, or unstoppable invader, depending on what the moment demanded. This flexibility was one of his greatest strengths. He understood that conquest was not only about winning battles, it was about controlling the story of the victory afterward. If people believed resistance was hopeless, many would surrender. If they believed he came as the breaker of Persian oppression, they might welcome him. If they feared him, they might still serve him. Alexander knew how to let all these impressions exist at once. But the real test could never remain local. Eventually, he would have to face the great king himself. That moment came with Darius III. The Persian king ruled an empire far greater than Alexander's kingdom, commanded enormous resources, and represented the political center of the Eastern world. This was not simply one monarch meeting another in battle. It was a collision between two systems of power. At Issus, despite the size of the Persian forces, Alexander won a stunning victory. Darius fled. His family fell into Alexander's hands. Symbolically, the effect was enormous. A king who had crossed into Asia as an invader now looked like a contender for the throne of Asia itself. Alexander's treatment of Darius's captured family became part of his legend. He could be savage in war, yet he also knew the political value of restraint and royal behavior. He presented himself as a king among kings, not a raider. Such moments mattered. They reinforced the idea that he was not simply tearing down an empire. He was positioning himself to inherit it. That difference would shape everything about the next stage of his campaign. Still, conquest was not straightforward. The siege of Tyre revealed Alexander's relentless will at its most terrifying. Tyre was heavily defended and difficult to reach. A lesser commander might have bypassed it. Alexander would not leave such a challenge unanswered. He built causeways, deployed engines, persisted through setbacks, and eventually took the city after a grueling siege. The achievement was militarily impressive and morally grim. It showed that obstacles did not discourage him. They provoked him. Once he fixed his attention on a target, he treated resistance as a personal insult that had to be answered with overwhelming force. From there, he moved into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. Egypt gave him more than territory. It gave him prestige, resources, and a new dimension to his identity. He founded Alexandria, a city that would outlive him and become one of the great centers of the ancient world. He also traveled to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa, a journey that fed the growing aura around his person. What exactly was said there remains uncertain. What matters is that Alexander's sense of his own special role seems only to have deepened. He was no longer just a Macedonian king leading a successful campaign. He was beginning to imagine himself in almost cosmic terms. Then came the battle that would decide the fate of the Persian Empire, Gaugamela. Darius assembled another vast force. The terrain was prepared. The stakes could not have been higher. If Alexander lost, his campaign might collapse. If Darius lost, the empire could be broken beyond repair. In the battle that followed, Alexander's tactical brilliance, the discipline of the Macedonian army, and the weaknesses in Persian coordination all combined to produce a decisive result. Darius fled again, and with that, the road to the imperial heartland opened. The cities that followed were not random prizes. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. These were names weighted with wealth, authority, and symbolism. To enter them was to step into the center of a world order that had seemed permanent. The treasures of Persia fell into Alexander's possession. The old imperial capitals acknowledged him, whether by surrender, flight, or defeat. And when Persepolis, ceremonial heart of Persian kingship, was burned, whether as deliberate policy, drunken impulse, symbolic revenge, or some combination of all three, the act sent a message that could be read in many ways. One age was ending in fire, another had already begun. By this point, Alexander had achieved what would have satisfied almost any ruler in history. He had crushed the Persian Empire. He had taken its capitals. He possessed unimaginable wealth. He was master of lands far beyond anything Philip had ruled. But Alexander was not made to stop where reason told him to stop. Victory did not calm him. It expanded him. The farther he went, the more impossible it became to imagine a natural limit. Men around him may have seen the empire as complete. Alexander saw only the next horizon. This is where his story becomes more complicated and in many ways darker. As he pushed deeper east into Bactria, Sogdiana, and beyond, warfare became harsher and more exhausting. These were not easy victories over a collapsing center. These were campaigns of resistance, pursuit, rebellion, and survival in difficult landscapes. The image of the shining conqueror began to mix with something harder. The ruler who demanded obedience from armies and subjects alike, no matter the cost. He adopted more elements of Persian kingship. He expected forms of respect that unsettled some Macedonians. The distance between Alexander and his companions grew. His inner circle began to feel the strain of serving a man who no longer seemed content with ordinary kingship. Some saw genius. Some saw dangerous transformation. Incidents of tension, suspicion, and violence multiplied. Friends, officers, and veterans who had helped carry him to greatness sometimes found themselves unable to understand the figure he was becoming. Power had elevated Alexander, but it had also isolated him. The more godlike he seemed to some, the less human he appeared to others. And still, he kept moving. In the east, he married Roxana, a union that carried both personal and political meaning. He continued founding cities, settling veterans, reorganizing territories, and stretching the fabric of empire across vast and often unstable spaces. He was not merely racing forward in conquest. He was trying, in his own way, to create a new order from the wreckage of the old one. Greek and Macedonian power mixed with Persian administration. Cultures met, clashed, and blended. Whatever else Alexander was, he was not small in vision. He wanted not just to defeat the world he found, but to remake it. Then came India, or more precisely, the northwestern regions beyond the Persian imperial frontier, lands that to many in the Mediterranean world were almost mythical in distance and mystery. Alexander crossed into this new arena, still searching for greatness beyond greatness. The campaign culminated in the Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus. It was a hard-fought victory and one of Alexander's most impressive battlefield achievements. Faced with war elephants, difficult weather, and a capable opponent, he adapted and prevailed. Yet even here, at the edge of triumph, the mood had changed. His army was tired. It had marched for years. It had crossed deserts, rivers, mountains, and empires. The victories remained real, but so did the exhaustion. Then, for the first time in a way that truly mattered, Alexander met a force he could not simply outcharge, outmaneuver, or terrify into submission, the will of his own soldiers. At the Hyphasis River, they refused to go farther. Ahead lay more lands, more rivers, more kingdoms, more uncertainty. Behind them lay years of blood, distance, and grief. Alexander tried to persuade them. He appealed to glory, to memory, to unfinished destiny. But men who had followed him through the destruction of empires finally said no. It was one of the most important moments of his life, because it revealed a truth even world conquerors cannot escape. Power has limits when the people carrying it can endure no more. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back. Yet retreat did not mean relief. The journey home was brutal. Hardships multiplied, losses mounted, especially in the Gedrosian desert, where the environment itself became an enemy as deadly as any army. If earlier campaigns had fed his legend with victory, these later movements showed the terrible price of relentless ambition. Greatness looked different when measured in the dead left behind on the march. And still, even after so much, Alexander's mind raced ahead. Returning westward, re-entering the old centers of his empire, he did not behave like a man ready to rest. He planned, reorganized, punished, rewarded, merged elites, arranged marriages, and imagined further campaigns. Arabia may have been next. Perhaps beyond that, even more. To the end, he seemed unable to think in terms of completion. His life had become a chain of horizons, each one conquered only to reveal another. Then in Babylon, in 323 BC, Alexander fell ill. The details of his final sickness remain debated, and likely always will. Fever, infection, poisoning theories, exhaustion, accumulated wounds. History leaves room for argument. What is not debated is the result. The man who had shattered empires and crossed the known world died at the age of 32. He had lived fast enough to fill several lifetimes and died before most rulers even reach their full authority. His death left behind one of history's great silences. A figure who seemed larger than the age itself vanished almost at the height of power. There was no settled succession strong enough to contain what he had built. The empire did not long remain whole. His generals, the Diadochi, fought over the inheritance. Kingdoms emerged from the fragments. Lines of loyalty shifted. The unity Alexander imposed through force could not survive him intact. In that sense, his empire failed. It did not remain one world under one crown. But that is not the end of the story, because political collapse is not the only way to judge historical success. Alexander's conquests transformed the ancient world. Greek language and culture spread widely across the Near East and beyond. New cities became centers of trade, administration, and learning. Old boundaries weakened. Contacts between peoples intensified. The Hellenistic world that emerged after his death carried his imprint everywhere. He did not simply redraw a map. He accelerated the mixing of civilizations. This is why Alexander remains so difficult to place in simple moral terms. He was brilliant, charismatic, courageous, and at times astonishingly generous. He was also ruthless, destructive, proud, and often consumed by a hunger that left little room for limits. He inspired extraordinary loyalty, but he also caused immense suffering. He dreamed on a scale few humans ever have, and he demanded that countless others pay the cost of that dream. To call him great is to recognize impact, not innocence. And yet the legend endures because Alexander reached into one of humanity's deepest fascinations, the idea that a single life, driven by will, talent, and audacity, can bend history itself. He took a kingdom many still considered peripheral and turned it into the center of the world's attention. He defeated armies larger than his own, toppled a giant empire, and carried his name farther than any Macedonian could have imagined. Even where he failed to hold what he conquered, he altered the future of everything he touched. Maybe that is why his story continues to feel almost unreal. It has the structure of myth, but it happened in the hard world of politics, steel, distance, and death. A boy raised on heroic poetry became a man who tried to outdo the heroes. A king inherited power and transformed it into a project without precedent. A conqueror reached the edge of the world he knew and discovered that the final frontier was not geography, but mortality. Alexander did not conquer the entire world. No one has. But within the world known to his age, he came closer than almost anyone before him to making that impossible dream look real. He conquered kingdoms, empires, roads, rivers, and cities. More than that, he conquered imagination. He made future rulers ask whether they too might be destined for something beyond ordinary rule. Caesar admired him. Napoleon was compared to him. Countless leaders have lived in the shadow of his example, whether they admitted it or not. In the end, that may be Alexander's greatest victory, not Persia, not Egypt, not Babylon, not the long march into Asia. His greatest victory was over time. Other kings ruled, other generals won battles, but Alexander became a standard, a symbol, a challenge sent across the centuries. What can one person do if he believes no boundary applies to him? How far can ambition go before it consumes itself? How much of greatness is vision, and how much is destruction? These are the questions Alexander leaves behind, and perhaps that is why his name still sounds less like a chapter in history and more like a force of nature. He rose from a kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, seized the inheritance of empires, and died before age could dull him. He never had the chance to become ordinary. he remains forever what he was in life, at his brightest and most dangerous, the man who came closer than anyone to conquering the world. But Alexander's story is not only about conquest, it is also about speed. Everything about him moved at an unnatural pace. His rise, his campaigns, his reinvention of kingship, his creation of myth. Many rulers build slowly, secure carefully, and age into authority. Alexander exploded into history. That speed is part of what made him so magnetic. He did not seem to live by the normal rhythm of human life. He seemed to race against an invisible deadline, as if he sensed that his time would be short and that only impossible achievements could satisfy the hunger inside him. That is why the image of Alexander still feels cinematic, even after more than 2 millennia. A young king crossing into Asia with a relatively small army. A line of cavalry driving straight toward the center of battle, royal capitals opening before him, desert marches, mountain fortresses, strange courts, new gods, foreign customs, exhausted veterans, and a commander who kept insisting that the map was not finished yet. His life contains triumph, tragedy, beauty, arrogance, and ruin in almost equal measure. It is the kind of story that civilization keeps retelling because it speaks to both the greatness and the danger of boundless ambition. And that is why he endures. He won more than most men, yet died before he could keep it. He mastered distance, but not even time. He reached the ends of his world, but never escaped the fate waiting for every conqueror.